Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Christopher Sands, and I'm director of the Canada Institute here. We like to think that we are the largest, actually we like to think we've done the research to say we are the largest research program on Canada outside Canada, which should be saying something, but sadly we are in a very small field, so it isn't. But we are delighted today to have with us two outstanding speakers, Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, who is Canada's Minister of Energy and Natural Resources. He is also MP for North Vancouver. We were just talking about that. He's previously been Minister for Environment and Climate Change and Minister for Fisheries, Oceans, and Canada's Coast Guard, a very stalwart member of the current government. And we also have the great Heather Reams, who is President of the Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, which is an NGO here, which is really bringing a lot of great ideas to the table so that we can have a sensible conversation about energy and natural resources. So you can see that this is a very thematic panel. We're delighted to have both speakers, and with no further ado, I'm going to turn the podium over to Minister Wilkinson.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here today and for hosting. And certainly great to have Heather here. We just had an opportunity to meet yesterday to talk about some of these issues. I'm going to maybe provide some framing remarks for the conversation that we're going to have after this. We have all, I'm sure, heard many times the adage that Canada and the United States are each other's best friend, closest allies, and most important economic partner. Though it may feel at times a little bit cliche to repeat those words, the statements are undeniably true. And beyond friendship and our economic partnership, we are steadfast partners on the world stage, which is ever more important these days given the increasingly aggressive behavior of certain international actors, including China. Beijing poses an increasing threat to our collective security and to our economies, given its control of key commodities such as critical minerals, and given its ability to flood our markets with cheap products that are produced with lax labor and environmental standards. On these fronts and many more, Canada has been and is a close partner of the United States. On the world stage, we see that presently in the wildfire response in California, where Canadian water bombers and firefighters are being deployed on an urgent basis to help our friends. But Canada is indeed a separate and a sovereign nation. Canada's national game is ice hockey. We wear toques. And we get our coffee and donuts from Tim Hortons, which is itself named after a hockey player. We are a country that is proud of having two official languages, French and English. Nous sommes très fiers d'avoir les deux langues officielles, français et anglais. Our political institutions are parliamentary, and we are enormously proud of the social safety net that we have collectively built over the past century. We Canadians respect our American friends. And we certainly admire the entrepreneurial spirit that exists in this country. Having spent 20 years in the technology community, I can tell you that that is something that Canadians think about a lot in the context of the productivity of our various economies. But Canadians are Canadians, and we will remain Canadian. Any suggestion to the contrary is, in my mind, a distraction from the challenges we both face, from an increasingly aggressive China, and a distraction from the real work that we should be doing to build on existing mutual benefits that our relationship produces, to seize enormous additional economic and security-related opportunities that are available moving forward. Presently, the U.S. and Canada work very effectively together in a whole range of different areas. Certainly, one is the management of our shared border, which is the world's longest non-militarized border. On the ground, Canadian and American officials work together every day to secure and efficiently manage the flow of goods and people across the border, while certainly identifying and addressing potential threats. Such cooperation is essential to both countries' prosperity and to their security. And while active collaboration on border matters has been going on for many, many years, we certainly recognize, and certainly as does the incoming Trump administration, that more can be done to further address issues of illegal migration, the shipment of drugs, and in the case of Canada, the movement of illegal firearms from the United States into Canada. While the scale of these issues at the Canada-US border is orders of magnitude lower than the challenges that are faced at the southern U.S. border, there is indeed more that can be done by intensifying the collaborative efforts between ours. Further to conversations that we've been having with the incoming Trump administration, Canada recently announced an enhanced border plan, which includes additional investments of $1 billion US in areas like deploying additional helicopters, drones, mobile surveillance towers, and officers with new canine teams to strengthen the border. Another area of long-standing mutually beneficial cooperation lies in continental air defense through NORAD. Our two countries have been working together under the NORAD banner for 70 years. We are committed to building on those existing ties and increasing collaboration in the defense space, and this includes a commitment on the part of Canada to achieving the 2% of GDP NATO target. With respect to our economic partnership, the Canada-US relationship is the envy of the world. There's about $2.7 billion worth of goods and services that go across that border every day in 2023. 36 U.S. states rely on Canada as their #1 export market. Canadian consumers and businesses purchase more goods from the United States than China, Japan, and Germany combined. Nearly half of the goods the U.S. buys from Canada are raw materials that are used by American manufacturers, contributing to jobs in the United States and to North America's overall competitiveness. Our economies are so integrated in terms of partnership that I would say they are effectively hardwired. This is true in many sectors, for example, the auto sector, where parts will go back and forth multiple times before you have a finished product to sell. But there is no area in which the integrated nature of our economies is clearer than in energy and key resources, such as critical minerals. For example, Canada supplies significant quantities of low-cost hydroelectricity to several U.S. states across fixed transmission lines. Canadian electricity powers the equivalent of 6 million American homes, which is more than every home in the state of Ohio. Canada and the U.S. have an integrated pipeline system that creates jobs and energy security. We supply about 4 million barrels a day through this network. That is primarily heavy crude, which is not produced in the United States, and U.S. firms have invested heavily in complex refineries to process low-cost Canadian heavy crude. This creates cost-related benefits for American companies and for American consumers. For Midwestern U.S. refineries, there are no real economically viable alternatives. And for U.S. Gulf refineries, there is an alternative with respect to heavy crude. It's Venezuela, hardly a friendly or a stable partner. This relationship is also reciprocal. American oil flows to Canada's east coast, where it contributes to energy security and to our economy there. With respect to natural gas, Canadian gas supplies parts of the U.S. where local supply simply doesn't exist, such as the Pacific Northwest and California. And Canadian gas that is shipped to the United States enables LNG processing and export facilities in the United States. Canada is the largest supplier of potash, which meeting the demands of the majority of American farmers for use as a fertilizer. Canadian potash limits transportation costs, enables low costs for the foods that American families put on their table. It also enables the U.S. to avoid purchasing from less reliable and more adversarial countries, including Russia. Uranium for nuclear power plants is also supplied in significant quantities by Canada. In fact, Canadian uranium presently powers the equivalent of almost 20 million American homes. Once again, this enables the U.S. to reduce exposure to less reliable uranium producers such as Russia. And Canada supplies significant quantities of critical minerals, including germanium, zinc, nickel, copper, and graphite, which are used in a range of American economic sectors, including defense-related applications. In the area of critical minerals, typically the alternative source of supply is China. In the area of energy and natural resources, the U.S. needs Canada, and Canada needs the USA. The economic relationship between Canada and the U.S. is indeed well balanced. If one looks at non-energy related trade, the U.S. actually has a trade surplus with Canada of about $50 billion US. And in the specific case of energy, the U.S. leverages the resource abundance that Canada possesses for energy and minerals that its economy requires. And it obtains low-cost energy and low-cost minerals, which allows the U.S. to access energy at a discount, and then thousands of American workers work to refine and transform it, and eventually sell it at higher prices to the rest of the world. It is a very good deal for the United States. In 2023, the U.S. exported $122 billion worth of refined products, roughly equal to the crude imports from Canada. Put simply, the U.S. cannot be energy dominant without Canadian energy. Canada and the U.S. presently derive significant mutual benefit from the free trade that exists between our respective countries, and it is important for Canadians and for Americans that this continue. The discussion of U.S. tariffs being levied on Canada is thus, for me, honestly, a little bit difficult to understand. The imposition of tariffs against the U.S.'s closest friend and economic partner will cause financial pain for Canadian families, no doubt. But it will also increase the prices of energy and food for American consumers. In the Midwest, for example, we estimate that gas prices could increase by up to 75 cents a gallon with the imposition of 25% tariffs. And as a sovereign democratic nation that must protect its own national interests, the unwarranted imposition of tariffs on Canada will necessarily require a response. And it is ultimately the people of our respective countries who will pay the cost. Rather than going down the path that will inevitably be lose-lose, I would suggest something completely different. I would argue that we should, in fact, underline and recognize the enormous benefits that are created from the economic flows that already exist, and that we should build further upon the current success to create additional value and jobs, to further enhance the energy prosperity of our two nations, and to collectively reduce the dependence that we presently have on non-aligned international actors, including China, by developing a U.S.-Canada energy and minerals alliance. This alliance could be an early priority between the incoming administration and Canada to enable us to achieve our shared vision for affordable energy bills for people, strong and secure economies, and North America as its own energy supplier and as an energy supplier to the world. Let me just give you a few specific examples of how we can move in the near term to create further mutual benefit that will create value all across the United States and Canada. In the area of critical minerals, which are needed for energy, for defense, and aerospace applications, and are mined in Canada's north and in several provinces, there's an opportunity to jointly invest in a project that would enable greater germanium supply, which can displace germanium the U.S. has been purchasing from China. And opportunities also exist with respect to gallium, another key mineral that China recently indicated it will not sell to the U.S. moving forward. We can work to enhance in the near term scandium and titanium supply from Quebec, which are both important for defense-related applications. And we can jointly work on rare earths processing and the augmentation of rare earth supply, once again reducing exposure to and dependence on China, which presently controls virtually all the processing of rare earths around the world. With regard to uranium, there's an opportunity to work together to expand access to Canadian uranium and to jointly work to complete the nuclear fuel cycle, reducing dependence on Russia and enhancing continental security. Ontario has expertise here in the form of small modular reactor development and uranium conversion. And of course, the United States has expertise in uranium enrichment. Similar opportunities exist with respect to reliance on Russia for potash. Saskatchewan has the potential to help even more in terms of U.S. farmers, with many projects that are already underway in Saskatchewan to ramp up production. We can enhance the flow of Canadian crude oil from Alberta to assist with the Trump administration's goal of energy dominance globally by working together on projects such as enhancing the capacity of the Enbridge Mainline and others. And we can work to jointly resolve the issues around Line 5, which would enhance the energy security for several Midwestern states. Of course, there is work ahead here too. We in Canada, as folks in the U.S., must make permitting of major projects more efficient and build on the opportunities for Indigenous peoples to benefit economically from such projects. There is much opportunity here that can benefit both countries, but none of this is possible if we get into a tit-for-tat exchange. Both countries have a strong interest in the same goals or outcomes, and there is an impetus for renewed and enhanced cooperation in an era of geopolitical uncertainty. Let our two independent and sovereign countries look to use this renewed joint effort as a basis on which to enhance cooperation and enhance mutual benefit in a range of other areas. There is indeed enormous potential if we work together to collectively onshore production and manufacturing, to concurrently ensure that access to critical energy and materials exists within our collective borders, and to ensure that we cannot be held hostage by countries and actors that do not share our values and that can be inherently unreliable. I started my remarks by mentioning that Canada is a hockey nation. In hockey, there have been dozens of dynamic duos, Gretzky and Curry for the Edmonton Oilers, Phil Esposito and Bobby Orr with the Boston Bruins, Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin with the Pittsburgh Penguins. But on the world stage, there is really only one partnership that truly stands out, and that is Canada and America. Our economic interties support jobs on both sides of the border. We fought in 2 world wars alongside each other, and we regularly respond to actively help address crises that take place in the other country, as is the case presently with the terrible wildfires in California. Whether it's hockey or perhaps football, the collective effort of a team is often what determines its success or failure on the ice or on the field. While a single talented player certainly can make a difference, a well-coordinated team is typically unstoppable. Such is the energy and minerals relationship between Canada and the United States. Rather than looking to erect barriers that will impede trade flows, increase costs for citizens on both sides of the border, and make both countries less secure, let us engage a conversation that is focused on seizing the enormous opportunities that presently exist to create additional shared value and to enhance collective security. Or in other words, we should form a true energy and minerals alliance. So thank you once again for the invitation to speak with you today, and I look forward to the conversation that will come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Would you like to speak from the podium? I'll turn the floor to you, whether you would like here, there, what would you be more comfortable with?
I'm just more comfortable sharing about my organization, but
Please do,
I can
please
do
do.
that.
Over to you.
Over to I'm Heather Reams. I'm the president of Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, based here in Washington, D.C., actually just across the street. It's kind of symbolic. Our offices are located between the Capitol and the White House because we work with both the administration and Congress. We were formed about 12 years ago to engage Republicans on the value of reducing emissions, but ensuring economic growth, national security, keeping energy prices affordable, but also maintaining a clean environment. We're one of the few organizations in Washington that focuses on right of center climate and policy advocacy. We also are an all the above organization. We recognize the need for natural gas. We're very excited by new technologies. We're motivated by innovation, and we work mostly with Republicans, but our goal is bipartisanship. Working here in the United States. For too long, one side of the aisle has been focused on environmental quality, at least very openly, while Republicans have been somewhat quiet. That has changed over time. Republicans are getting back to their conservation legacy of President Roosevelt was a huge conservationist. President Nixon created the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. So building on a lot of the building blocks that the Republicans have had over years, really engaging in a place that is uniquely Republican. It doesn't mean Republicans are going to vote like Democrats. So the engagement that you're seeing by Republicans on environmental issues and energy may be different than that of Democrats. It doesn't mean they're not interested in lowering emissions. They're just getting there in a different way. So my perspective is shaded by that and engaging Republicans, mostly on the United States side, but certainly recognizing the benefits of working with our northern neighbors in Canada. And I'll stop there. Back to you.
That's wonderful, and thank you very much, Heather, for that. I know that one of the things that Republicans sometimes do, they achieve things and then they don't always promote them enough, so people forget that they have this legacy, which you rightly point out. I think the same is true sometimes for Canada, Minister, in that there are so many things that Canadians feel are self-evident about the relationship but need to be reminded. The public needs to be reminded again and again. So I'm going to open this question up to both of you, really. How would you describe our current energy relationship? How are things going, and what could we be doing to improve them?
I'll say a couple things. I mean, certainly Minister, you laid out a lot of important statistics and data, so I'll maybe put some more color on that, if that's all right. So I think one of the areas where particularly the United States, but Republicans have been focusing on is the critical mineral piece. As this audience may well know, between the 70 and 90% of the critical minerals are mined and processed in China, and that monopoly really puts us all at a disadvantage if there is any challenges dealing with China that escalate beyond where they are right now. And we've actually seen some of China actually lean in and putting moratoriums on exports to the United States. I'm not sure if that's been the case to Canada, but it has been to the United States, and that's concerning. So if we're going to see increased escalation by any kind, and certainly through trade, this is putting the United States and our partners at a disadvantage. So I think this is a prime location and for collaboration is on the critical minerals. I mean, after all, we do share the same soil virtually. It's a border that's only that we know of, but the land doesn't know that. We share a lot of the environmental protections, the human rights protections. There's a lot of values that we have the same. So exporting, in the same way and working together is, to me, a no-brainer. That's why I think this Minerals Alliance that you've proposed, Minister, is incredibly interesting. And really working with the U.S. working with our allies is, I think, we can't do it alone. And looking north to our neighbors and friends in Canada makes immediate sense. There are other countries we can be working with, but none are as close geographically. Not to mention when you're working closely, you're not shipping and transporting, which also keeps emissions low as well. So there's a lot of efficiency to be gained with the geography between the two countries. There's also benefit we can share in technology. And the benefits. There's a lot, I've been privy to a lot of presentations about the benefits of mining underground and in new advanced technologies. And sharing this technology abroad and giving this technical assistance with one another is also going to drive efficiency, drive down emissions, I think is also a win-win. So there's some areas where I think are positive. I didn't touch on the oil and gas, but certainly we've tried with pipelines and others to create efficiencies there as well. As this group knows, the Republicans do believe in pipelines. They're a very efficient form of transferring energy, and it's something that I think the Trump administration and Republican members in Congress would be interested in revisiting to ensure that there is a steady flow of the energy that's needed to fuel our mutual economies.
Excellent, Minister.
So agree with all of that. I would say the current relationship, I think, actually is working quite well. But as I said in my speech, there's more we can do. I think people sometimes forget how much it's changed. The energy dynamic has changed. If you think back to the oil embargo in the 1970s, there was an enormous dependence in the United States on fuels that actually came from Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. That has fundamentally flipped, such that there is very little that the U.S. imports from non-aligned countries. Over 60% of the oil that is imported in the United States comes from Canada. And the United States has actually used that as a platform to ensure they're producing low-cost fuels and enabling them to actually export the light sweet crudes that are produced here in the United States, which enables then geopolitical influence in the context of providing energy to other countries. So I would say that is important. We have seen how powerful energy can be in geopolitics. The Russian invasion of Ukraine showed us that in terms of what happened to Germany. And we see it in the context of what Russia now is doing in supplying India. So I do think that there is more that we can do to build on what we can provide collectively to the world, which will actually enhance the ability to actually have influence in the world. I totally agree on critical minerals. We collectively, as a Western democratic group of countries, I would say have been a bit asleep at the wheel in terms of the importance of the development of critical minerals. China controls most of the production, virtually all of the processing. And that is strategic. The Chinese made that decision that they were going to do that decades ago and have been executing a very well thought out strategy. We have to change that. Critical minerals are something we need, and the Chinese have figured out that they are able to use critical minerals as a tool, including the recent banning of germanium, gallium, and antimony sales to the United States. So the focus going forward for us has to be, yes, utilizing the critical minerals that we already have, but it's about accelerating the development of critical minerals in the United States, in Canada, processing technologies in the United States, in Canada, and reaching out to countries like Australia, who are going to be really important in this conversation as well.
Minister, the Canadian government's plan for critical minerals, your critical minerals strategy, focuses on midstream, that processing piece, which is got two characteristics I understand. One is that it costs a lot of money to build processing facilities, and secondly, that there is potentially environmental impact if you do it wrong. And so Canada, as a trusted partner on the environment side, as well as a stable market in which we can put a lot of money, or anyone can put money, is a key piece. Can you talk a little bit about what Canada's strategy is on processing? And Heather, from your sense, what's the U.S. priority in terms of processing, and how do we build that out?
Do you want to start?
Go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, processing is really important. And there are the processing of certain kinds of metals that are reasonably well understood and do exist in Canada and to a certain extent in the United States. The U.S. has had a more difficult time, I think, building processing facilities. It's funny because in Canada we often beat ourselves up about how long it takes to develop mines and major projects. But when I speak to Secretary Granholm about this, she says, oh, you guys are light years ahead of us in terms of being able to actually get these done. Things like copper and nickel, it's easier. But if you think about lithium and rare earths and graphite, much more challenging, in part because the technology for the processing was developed in China. Australia has large-scale processing plants for lithium. They're all Chinese-owned, and the technology is protected. So we are investing a lot in the development of processing technologies. Typically looking for ways to actually develop technologies that don't have the environmental impacts that some do. That's true of lithium. It's very much true of rare earths, where we have a program in Saskatchewan that's working on that. Many Americans won't know, but the one large rare earth mine that exists in the United States, 100% of the product is processed in China. So that is a critical part. Yes, we need more mines, but we also need the ability to actually process those. And that's something that, to be honest with you, we don't need every G7 country to be building processing facilities for every kind of metal. We actually need to be strategic. We can start between Canada and the United States, and then we can actually work through this with Britain, France, Japan, et cetera. So,
Heather, I'm going to make the question slightly more pointed for you. One thing we know about the nominees for the new Trump administration is there are an awful lot of people who know a lot about investing. And when we talk about pooling capital to figure out, so we don't have 18 lithium processing plants when we only need 5, like figuring out where the priorities are and so on, do you see this as something that that should be a higher priority for us going forward?
One, it needs to be a higher priority, but there's the point of permitting is just, I think I can't overstate the need for permitting and how it's holding back the United States and its ability to be able to just simply mine. Whereas some permitting is, somewhere between 4 to 7 years plus some litigation that's oftentimes in it. And mining, we're dealing with a decade and more. So this is incredibly capital intensive with no guarantee that you're actually going to be able to mine, no return. So there's very few companies that can do this, and many of them are coming from Australia and bringing in the expertise that they have. So the United States is not sending the signal, come here and mine and be part of our solution. And I think the Trump administration and the Republicans in Congress intend to reset that. And that's why permitting reform is such an important part. But that still takes time. There's still going to be environmental reviews. There's still going to be, a demand for our critical minerals. So that interim time is, I think, where my headspace is, and looking at a lot of pieces of what the incoming administration is saying, what they'll actually do, because of the realities at strike once you get into the Oval Office and into the seats on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of next week. The ability to move forward is much more difficult. So while we have these very talented and with tremendous backgrounds, whether it's Chris Wright, Department of Energy, or Governor Burgum coming from North Dakota, and certainly and from the tech sector, understanding what's at stake and what's needed, there's a reality that's going to set in, and the ability of looking to our allies and our closest neighbors is going to be really important to be able to get there. Yes, Congress needs to act, but what about in between? And I think that's something that I think is really going to be telling about how the administration maneuvers within that, and also, in Congress supporting the administration.
I'm going to come right back to you, Heather. One of the things that the minister raised, and I think was an interesting point, is supplying our allies. And this is more on the oil and gas, maybe critical mineral side than electricity per se, but a lot of our allies have been looking for alternatives. I know Japan buys a lot of their gas from Russia right now, which they don't want to be doing, et cetera. The U.S. has been more successful in building export infrastructure than Canada has on its coasts, but how do we work together to make sure that we're there for them? I know that's part of energy preeminence, but it's also part of keeping the alliance together.
I think I'll jump in here on that one. I think it's producing what's here at home, and I'll say North America is kind of being that home. Our excess needs and exporting them around the world, whether it's from Canada or the United States, both. I think it's incredibly, geopolitically, of course, we all know that's really important. But looking at life cycle emissions, we know that what's produced in the United States and Canada is far cleaner than it is in Russia. It's about 41% reduction in life cycle emissions when the same product is produced in the United States as opposed to Russia. So you think about the Europeans switching out their natural gas with LNG from Russia, using the U.S., they're lowering emissions even when we're transporting it across the ocean. Japan can benefit from the same. So this idea, and you think about the emerging economies around the world, of course they want to transition from whatever they're using, coal or worse, to natural gas. I mean, that displacement is also the ability to lower emissions. So there is a positive story to tell when we have our countries working together to have a high quality product in the United States, keep prices low, both for the United States and Canada, and then that exporting piece of it. It's really a truly remarkable story of working together if we could really pull it off.
Minister, you were Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and I think a lot of countries are either with frustration or however coming to the conclusion that net zero by 2050 is going to be a very tough goal for any country to meet at the moment. Is there a sense of energy pragmatism that you're picking up in Canada and maybe here, where we're doing our best and we're going to try to make progress where we can? Not to take away from the goals, but that there needs to be a kind of, as you said, an all modes in discussion.
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say I have always been kind of an energy pragmatist because I do think there are a whole range of different pathways, some of which have been invented and probably some of which are still to be invented. I remain, and the government of Canada remains, committed to the net zero by 2050 goal, as do the Europeans. In fact, they're more aggressive. It's for many of them, it's 2045, and the Japanese, et cetera. But we do have to be pragmatic about the pathways. Increasingly, it's not just about renewables. It's about nuclear power, whether that's large-scale reactors like the CANDUs that we develop or Westinghouse's design. The small modular reactors that are being running. The first one will be running in Ontario in 2028, 300-megawatt reactor. But it's also alternatives in terms of the continued utilization of natural gas. In countries like Canada, where you have the ability to sequester carbon, that is a total alternative. And in countries like Japan, where you can't actually easily sequester carbon, pathways like pyrolysis, which drop the carbon out as a solid, are absolutely things we are investing in. I spent 20 years in the energy technology space developing technologies like that. The goal remains the same, but we have to be pragmatic about how we achieve it. And in terms of energy solutions, it's all of the above.
Heather, I know you follow the Capitol Hill closely, and one of the things that people here have been thinking about is some of the energy-related provisions in the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, in particular the ability to recycle automotive batteries to keep those critical minerals in the stream rather than just throwing them in the dump, I guess.
Right.
Also, there's some very aggressive encouragement of carbon capture, utilization, and storage technology. It's drawn a lot of Canadian companies into the U.S. to participate. How do you see us moving forward on something so complicated? And I know you can't speak for Congress, but just there's some of those provisions that people will miss.
We'll overlook. Yeah, it's
yeah.
true. I mean, I think there's some of the challenges in the politics. So a lot of times we were seeing in the Biden administration talking about recycling, but recycling our way to all critical minerals doesn't exist.
Right.
And then there's also been, well, then we'll get those critical minerals from other places around the world. Well, that's not really practical either. And if we know anything about supply chains and learned that, particularly, I think the average American person learned about supply chains during COVID, simply getting a mask or getting toilet paper or just basic necessities, we need to secure those supply chains with reliable partners, and then also domestically. I mean, Republicans are going to want to see the supply chains being very strong in the United States. So, but working with our allies, certainly with Canada and others, to ensure that the supply chains are shored up. And that is not the case right now. So I see that being a very large priority. In terms of the IRA, as you all know, it was not a single Republican voted for it, but the components of the bill, many of it were bipartisan to begin with. So its genealogy is bipartisan, while the process was partisan. So the idea is to kind of unpack this, the IRA, and look at who are the supporters and now who's benefiting as well. If a member Republican was a supporter of a energy storage tax credit, for instance, looking at, which of course requires a lot of critical minerals, that member, we're going to go back to them again and talk to them. What do you see as opportunities? But also there are a number of Republican districts that are benefiting from the IRA as well. So I don't see the IRA an outright repeal, but I think some of the more pragmatic pieces sometimes can get cut, right? They're on the cutting room floor, unfortunately, and it's up to advocates and organizations to really highlight this is effective. This is an effective use, and it should be an and, not an or, as we're creating policy.
Minister, I'm struck, we talk about how do we move things forward. One of the things that's always worked in the U.S. and it's been very bipartisan is when national security becomes the framing of something. It's certainly got a lot of people concerned. You referenced it in the speech, the concern about China, the concern about Russia, et cetera. Does national security obviously has its limits, but you also talked about Canada reaching 2%, of GDP on defense spending. Is Canada thinking differently about national security? And then I'll bounce it to Heather to talk about how she thinks national security is changing the conversation.
Yeah, I think so. The world has changed a lot. From the period we entered after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Increasingly, we have entered a period where, the growth of China in terms of its economic might is changing the dynamic and its ability to create influence on the world stage through the Belt and Road initiatives, through the agreements with a range of other countries under the BRICS. I think, the United States increasingly has a direct rival. And of course, Russia continues to be an actor that also is important, but perhaps a little bit less important than China. We need to be thinking about security a lot differently. Climate change is forcing that as well, with the melting of the ice in the Arctic. And so Canada needs to be far more prepared to be able to defend its sovereignty in the north. That means investments in the Navy. That means investments in the Air Force. And in a world that is increasingly uncertain, we do need to ensure that we are prepared for that. So, meeting the 2% NATO target, I think, is important. And to be honest, the recent experience with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think, underlines that as well. So I think you will see more in the way of that. But I also think the national security considerations have to flow into conversations about the economy. We've talked a lot about critical minerals. But the Chinese have had some pretty well-constructed economic plans related to the whole conversation around the energy transition. Like it's not by chance that China is now the #1 manufacturer and deployer of renewable energy technologies. And if you're buying solar panels, you're probably buying them from China. That's something that, as we move forward in the all of the above, we have to figure out how we ensure that there is supply that doesn't come solely from China. The same thing is true, and I know it's a little bit controversial here, but of electric vehicles. Like 6 months ago, for the first time in China, you can manufacture an electric vehicle for less than what you can actually manufacture an internal combustion engine vehicle. And that's without taking into account all of the cost benefits associated with electricity being cheaper than gasoline and the lower maintenance costs. The life cycle of those vehicles costs are way lower. And that's because they've focused, and they've actually figured out how to deploy such they come down the manufacturing cost curve. We actually are going to have to make a choice about things like that. It's, in my view, it's a better mousetrap. It's probably, from a technology perspective, going to win the day. If we don't manufacture them here, we're going to end up buying them from China, which creates strategic vulnerability. So the whole national security thing needs to be brought much more fulsomely into the conversations we're having about the economy.
And Heather, I'm going to turn this to you, and I'm just pulling something out of your, very, very much out of your title. You're with the citizens first. So like you think about, how do we talk to the public? How do we talk to Americans, Canadians about why this is important? It's very complicated stuff. So maybe as you think about this, like, how do we convince people? Because certainly authoritarian governments have it easy in a way. They just shoot people who disagree with them. But we can't do that here. We don't want to do that. We're going to have a conversation with people about the trade-offs, and it's going to be painful. So I just turn it over to you.
And think about having a conversation of isolationism versus globalism, right? And those tensions that are there. We're moving closer to an administration that's going to have more of an isolationism streak to it versus globalism. And while that presents some opportunities and onshoring supply chains, working closely with allies, it also creates some vulnerabilities of ceding ground to adversaries like China. And we know that China has been gaining ground in the developing worlds, for instance, and creating these allies, building airports, building soccer stadiums, owning mines, and critical infrastructure. So isolationism is going to only give more ground to the Chinese and any other adversaries that choose to. So that value proposition, I think, is something that most Americans understand in some way. But, the details of that, I mean, if I go to my grandmother and say globalism, she'd be like, "What are you talking about?" So you got to break it down in more ways about what are the implications. Think in terms of national security, looking at the supply chains. Of course, we've talked about uranium, rare earths, what's needed to build these advanced technologies to be able to protect us. And these are mainly unmanned equipment that we're using that are heavily reliant on critical earths and rare earths. Cybersecurity that's there as well. The national security goes on and on and on. And we are faced right now with wildfires, right? So this is not a technology. This is something that's, we've known fire for a long time and its threat. But, look how it's taking over an entire geography, maybe an entire country, and now bringing in allies to help us, battle something. So we are vulnerable, and I think working to shore up those vulnerabilities together, amongst our countries, but sharing intelligence and sharing technology makes a whole lot of sense. And I think that type of communication to the average person is very, very helpful in getting out of that globalism versus isolationism and talking about what are the benefits that we'll see by having some kind of middle ground.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things I mentioned about the Wilson Center is that we have the Canada Institute, and that's I'm very proud of that. But we also have one of the best audiences ever, anywhere, both here and online. And so I want to open this up to questions from our esteemed audience. If you could introduce yourself, tell us who you are, where you're from, or who you're working for, whatever you would like. We'll take some questions from all of you. I have a question here from Eric Miller, who I know, so I can at least introduce him by name.
Minister, great to see you here. Good presentation. So one of the discussions that has been happening here in Washington is around the question of price support for critical minerals. The way that China is able to execute its dominance is that it controls a lot of the manufacturing and can put materials on the market and take them off the market kind of at will. And so people such as the House China Committee are looking at kind of a declaration that this is not a free market and that you have something like a floor price mechanism in place to help shore this up. What is your thinking about that sort of idea, or are there other ideas you're working on to try to structurally position investments in mines and refineries to survive over the China influence price cycle over the medium to longer term?
That is an excellent question. So we are thinking a lot about that. And it's a price floor to address the manipulation. But there's also a concurrent conversation around how do you ensure that, particularly as it relates to democratic countries that will be purchasers of critical minerals, that there is an accounting for the environmental and labor standards associated with the production. Like, we in Canada and in the United States are not going to go into a downward spiral on labor standards in order to compete with China. That's just not what we're going to do. But we need to acknowledge that we do have labor standards that do add costs. And so that has to be built into this conversation around pricing. So we have been having that conversation with the Biden administration, with a number of members of the Senate and Congress. And we are hopeful to engage the Trump administration in that. Our thinking has been that it would actually be one of the centerpieces of the conversations we would then be having at the G7, which Canada is the president of the G7 this year, because it has to be broader than just Canada-US, and it shouldn't just be Canada or just the US. Like, this is something that Germany's going to have to deal with, and Japan's going to have to deal with, et cetera. So a G7 initiative that could then be expanded to G7 plus, including Australia and a number of other countries that are going to be important in this conversation. But we cannot be in a position where China can simply manipulate the market. And we've seen it recently with nickel, with dumping of nickel, which has created enormous problems for our Australian friends. But we've seen it with a number of other things in the past. If we want mines to be developed, investors will have to have some degree of certainty, in addition to the permitting reform, which is important, some degree of certainty that the products that they're actually producing are going to have value at the end of it. And if China can simply intervene and crater the price, you will never see the development of the critical minerals that we have to. So, but this is something that cannot be addressed by one country on its own. It's a strong argument for, yes, at times we need to work independently, and I recognize that the Trump administration, in some respects, will want to, in many areas, will want to act unilaterally. But this is an argument for multilateral cooperation, and we can be successful, but we have to work together.
And Heather, let me extend the question to you, because one of the things we saw in the last administration, or still the current one, I guess, was a discussion of how the Defense Department would look at critical mineral stockpiling and how it would prioritize certain minerals and so on. Is that something you see being an important part of our critical mineral strategy, having a sort of China-free stockpile for military and other purposes?
I actually expect in this administration to see some kind of executive order, some movement towards creating stockpiles, whether it's a day one executive order or moving towards that. So that would be a signal to the market. Second, we've been, and I shared this with the minister yesterday, we've been supportive of exploring legislation and looking at carbon intensity and human rights, environmental standards as well, and working in a very collaborative, right, and you're exactly right, not one or two countries can do this. This is something G7 plus of prioritizing products, but particularly critical minerals in this case, and how they're produced, and having some kind of floor of what's acceptable and what's not. You can always cheat the market if you can by lowering standards, but what are you getting? You're just creating some kind of unhealthy need. And what we're trying to do in terms of an energy transition is getting away from having one kind of source, is really owning the barrel of oil or whatever it is, and we can't trade it for one country having that on critical minerals. So if, what kind of people are we? We're kind people, right? We're people who value human rights and environmental standards, and we should probably put that as part of our priorities in terms of trade as well. So it's something that we're interested in seeing, in studies and other things that Congress can put forward is something we've been promoting.
I'll certainly say that shared values has been the basis of Canada-US for a long time, and we do share many of those values. Other questions from the room? Those of you who are watching online, if you send an email to Canada at wilsoncenter.org, we'll try to get your questions in as well. Looking for anyone? Yes, Ian Ching. I'll let you introduce yourself. Sorry, I know too many
Hi,
people.
I'm a student of Dr. Sands at Johns Hopkins, and thank you very much for coming, Minister.
And also from Vancouver.
I'm from Vancouver as well, and I had the...
A lot of Vancouverites.
Given that your government has instituted a carbon pricing on energy, and you've mentioned today that you want to make Canadian energy something that's competitive in the international market, how do you go about kind of squaring the fact that Canadians have to pay a premium, especially in British Columbia, and you're writing that we have to pay like a 40-50% premium on gas, when going to Washington we get that for, half off. How is that something that how are voters supposed to, stomach that kind of distinction?
And I'll clarify, he means Washington State, where Heather's from also.
So Canada has put a price on carbon. We often call it a price on pollution. And there are two components to that. There is a retail price that consumers pay, which is what you're talking about, and then there's an industrial price, which large emitters pay. We've structured the large emitter price in a manner that protects those companies from competitiveness issues, because carbon leakage is a challenge, but that incents them to be able to focus on reducing their emissions. So they have to achieve a certain benchmark relative to their peers. And that is really aimed at ensuring that large emitters are thinking about emissions and how to actually reduce emissions as they actually move along. The more they reduce emissions, the less they pay. The retail price exists on carbon-based fuels, so typically oil and gas. And it does increase the price at the pump, and it increases the price of natural gas that you use to heat your home. But the government doesn't keep that money in Canada. What the government does is it essentially rebates that money back to consumers. So you have a price signal that incents behaviors that are around efficiency. So when you, instead of putting in a new natural gas furnace, you put in a heat pump, which has the added benefit that you get air conditioning. You think about the next time you buy a car, either buying a non-emitting vehicle or a more fuel-efficient vehicle, such that you are reducing your price. But the rebate you get back is an average rebate for every household. And what the data shows is 8 out of 10 Canadian families get more money back than they pay. So if you drive a Hummer, you have a 6,000 square foot house, and you have a big boat in your backyard, you probably pay more. But the average Canadian actually pays less. And in fact, it works directly inverse to income. So it's actually the most vulnerable people in Canadian society that get the most back relative to what they pay. If you live in an apartment and you take public transit, you're actually way better off. So we have tried to structure it in a way that addresses affordability, which is, I think, your point, but also creates a price signal that incents people to reduce their emissions. And I will just say, this is a topic of lots of conversation in Canada, but it is by far the most efficient way to reduce emissions. It's way more efficient than regulating. It's way more efficient than simply spending money and making investments. 99.9% of economists will tell you it is the best way from an efficiency perspective to reduce emissions, and we've done it in a way that's affordable. So that's how Canada thinks about it.
Excellent. Jamie Tronis.
Hi, Minister. I'm Jamie Tronis. I'm with the Center for North American Prosperity and Security, which is a project of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute based here in Washington, D.C. I thought that your remarks have been very focused on the collaborative nature of how Canada and the U.S. can work together as a shared partnership. But what I'm also interested in hearing from you is any information or expanded policy that you can talk about in terms of what retaliation might look like if tariffs are put on Canada, whether that would involve critical minerals, increasing price of our gas exports, or perhaps other exercising of leverage. If you could expand on that, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Such a peaceful discussion.
No, it's a good question. I am, first and foremost, I mean, my objective in being in Washington, and I'm sure I will be here often, is to try to make the case as to why there shouldn't be tariffs. And in the event that there are tariffs at the beginning, why they should be essentially removed. And we had to make that case with steel and aluminum during the first Trump term, and eventually successfully made that case, and those tariffs were removed. But I would say, you know, Canada is a sovereign nation. The people of Canada, if there are tariffs imposed, would expect their government to respond to protect their interests. That would be true of any country in the world. But we obviously want to do that in a thoughtful way. We are not interested in something that escalates. That is something that will simply cause pain for everyone. And so we are still in the process of sorting out exactly how we will respond. Part of it depends a little bit on what the nature of the tariffs are. You know, one of the questions is, will it be broad-based across the board? Will there be exemptions for certain kinds of products? We don't know that. And until we know that, it's hard for us to say exactly how we will respond. But I would say the principle that will underline any response will be looking at least initially, products that are important exports for American producers in the United States that are coming into Canada, that if we actually didn't have those exports, or if those exports were significantly more expensive, that Canadians would have access to alternatives that would be more cost effective. Obviously, the point of response is to try to create more political pressure in the United States to engage the conversation about removing the tariffs. But we're not going to do that in a blind way.
Thank you, Minister. I'm going to take two questions at the same time because I know we're coming up a little bit on time. For the gentleman there and the gentleman here, let's start with you, sir, because I saw you first.
Hi. I'll actually defer because that was my exact question. So if anyone, I can come up with a different question, but if there's a second person who'd like to take my question, that's available.
Canadian rooms, everyone's so nice.
Oh, I'm American.
But it rubs off. It rubs off. It's terrible. Well, why don't I ask you to ask your question while you're thinking of yours? And I see the gentleman next to him is going to jump in as well. We'll just get those, but thank you, sir.
Sounds good. Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre. Félix Blanchette avec le gouvernement du Québec. I'll bring back sunny ways. So we talked about the countermeasures. I'd like to come back at, you've made an advocacy for the alliance, U.S.-Canada alliance on energy and critical minerals. So I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that and what you see as this potential alliance in terms of the framework and so on.
Okay, bien sûr.
And then we'll let him jump in as well.
Yeah, actually, my question dovetails with that nicely. I'm Nick Lombardo. I'm with an organization here in DC called ClearPath, working very closely with our friends at CRESS across the aisle, mostly with Republicans and looking for bipartisan solutions. But on this alliance idea, as we all know, the USMCA is also up for review in 2026. So I'm kind of curious your thinking of how those two might mesh together as we're going through that review, and is there some nexus between those two ideas?
Excellent. Minister, do you want to start and then
Yeah, sounds great.
Bien sûr, c'est quelque chose qui est très important. J'ai discuté avec Madame Blanchette-Vézina samedi, je crois. Mais this is an important conversation, and obviously we are engaging that with our partners in the provinces and territories. I just said that I had a conversation with his minister on Saturday about this. So the alliance, the idea would be, I gave you a number of examples of things that we think could be very valuable to the United States, but also would have value to Canada. But there are almost certainly many more. And part of the conversation that we are suggesting we have would be to sit down and actually lay out all of the different opportunities and to prioritize those in terms of how we actually move forward. Some of them will be in the broader energy space, and many of them, I think, will be in the critical mineral space. We do have an existing partnership with the United States on critical minerals. The Defense Production Act in the DoD invests alongside my department for earlier stage critical minerals projects, and there are a couple of those in Quebec that have been announced. but it is relatively small scale. I think the total that the DoD has invested in Canada, and they invest in the same way that they invest in the United States, they treat Canada as the US, is probably $50 or $60 million. We need to, order of magnitude, more than order of magnitude in terms of the investments that we are going to make in mines, in processing technology development, eventually in processing facilities. So I would see the alliance as actually coming together, prioritizing, and then really focusing resources on those things that are going to be the most important moving forward. We have our ideas about what could be the most important, but this obviously would have to be a bilateral conversation that we agree on the priorities, and we agree on what we're each willing to put on the table in terms of investments that could be made.
Heather?
And also, the bilateral part makes sense. I mean, creating a framework, I think, is, do we both agree this is needed? That yes, and I can imagine that the United States would have its needs. Obviously, Canada is able to permit more quickly. It has resources that are readily available. I can imagine the United States would be requesting to have access to those critical minerals more quickly as it gets its own supplies on board. Talking about the stockpiles. For those pieces, I think those are some of the areas, like those first pieces. But it does dovetail into the trade agreements, and I wanted to comment on that. Kick it over to you. Just an observation is, and I mentioned this to you yesterday, Minister. These trade agreements are between. Somehow Canada is being treated the same as Mexico in a lot of ways, and I think. As you mentioned, citizens representing citizens, it is a little bit surprising to see that Canada and Mexico are being treated the same. So I expect that we're going to see a different engagement with Mexico than we're going to see with Canada because of the porous border and with the what Canada is putting in towards $1 billion, I think, in additional costs, and could be more in the future. I can imagine this is going to be a good news to the Trump administration that's prioritizing a border. And as Americans know, but Canadians probably know too, the border is probably one of the single largest issues in the United States. And for voters, it was in maybe the number one or number two. So securing that is very important. But bringing that into the trade agreement in 2026, I think, is when it can be evaluated. I mean, these are times to be able to, do we see tariffs and this trade coming together? Possibly. I mean, what I've been reading from some of the experts, we're going to see. I think it will not be business as usual, is what we're seeing. Now, what that means, I don't really have a clear sense of this is all what I mean, but I think this administration is definitely going to want to flex its muscles, and that's why I think some of these alliances and laying out some of these principles ahead of time is going to be very important.
Yeah, so there is a review on the books that will happen. I mean, obviously, when you're talking about a free trade agreement, the imposition of tariffs kind of runs directly counter to the idea of a free trade agreement. So there will have to be some reconciliation there. And my hope is that we have found pathways through which to amicably address the conversation around tariffs well before we get into the discussion about the review. The review will, as I say, happen. As folks will be aware, there was a renegotiation of the original agreement during the first Trump presidency, and that ended up being an agreement that everybody thought was a good deal. And I have every confidence that we can end up in a similar position down the road. At the end of the day, it's good thing that agreements are reviewed periodically. Obviously, things change, so it's not a bad thing. I would just say one other thing, which is we talked a lot about sort of the need to advance critical minerals here in the United States and in Canada for the purpose of actually meeting the collective needs that we have in a range of different applications. But to just underline the scale of the challenge that we actually face, it's not just Canada, U.S., like Japan needs them, Germany needs them, France needs them, the UK needs them, and none of those countries have them, right? The UK says it has a little bit of lithium, but I mean, by and large, it's going to end up being the United States, Canada, Australia, South America, like Chile, Peru, that are going to supply, and parts of Africa that are going to supply all of this. So
It's an exciting thought, Minister and Heather, because we were once known as the breadbasket of the world. We were once known as the arsenal of democracy. Will our future be the powerhouse of the free world? It's a possibility. I want to thank you and to invite everyone else to join me in thanking Minister Jonathan Wilkinson and Heather Reams from the Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions for a dynamic presentation, and thank you all for coming to the Wilson Center.
thank you.